Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation. My name is Stephen White. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America. We will begin without much ceremony, but before I introduce our three guests today, I want to say a special word of thanks to Sarah Perla, our Communications Manager, for helping to plan this event and putting everything together for us so we could be here today. She's coming up on her first year anniversary with us at the Catholic Project, so she's been a blessing to us, so thank you for everything. Now for the reason that we're here, victims assistance coordinators are often sort of the first responders when an allegation of sexual abuse is reported to the church. Not too many people know about the work they do, and we'd like to change that. We're joined today by three wonderful people, each of them who fills the role of victims assistance coordinator for their respective diocese or archdiocese. In alphabetical order, Heather Banas has been victims assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles for the last 5 years, serving for more than a decade before that as a clinical consultant to the Victims Assistance Ministry. She has a PhD in clinical psychology, as well as a master's in theology and leadership. Courtney Chase is the victim assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of Washington, where she has been for over 6 years. She's a licensed clinical social worker with a master's in social work from the Catholic University of America. Tom Thrile has been the victims assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of Chicago for 10 years. He's a licensed clinical social worker and was involved in the development of the Healing Garden for Survivors in Chicago. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I want to start with a story that those of us here have heard before, but it's a story that I think sets the tone for our conversation well. Heather, you told us about an experience you had. You were living in Boston around the time of sort of the first big wave of abuse allegations that came out in 2002, and the priest in the parish where you were did something very interesting. Can you tell us that story?
Absolutely. My family and I had moved to Boston for reasons completely unrelated to my work, nor did I have any idea at that point in time that I would be doing this work shortly thereafter. But we moved to a suburb area of Boston proper and started attending Mass at the local parish as all was breaking loose in Boston. And our pastor, every single Sunday, got up in the pulpit and apologized to everyone seated in that church for what had happened and all that it impacted, all that it had done to those who'd been impacted, both the victim survivors themselves and those in their families and communities. And he did this every Sunday, week after week after week. And it was much appreciated by many, hugely appreciated by some, and actually very difficult and not appreciated by some, because the very idea of talking about that in the church with children present was upsetting to some people, which has always struck me with an odd sort of feeling of irony. But there it was. And I have to say, as a psychologist, I was so grateful and so impressed that he was willing to do that and persisted in doing that despite the mixed feedback that he was getting. I thought it was critical and impactful, and I'll never forget those moments.
One of the things that you mentioned in a previous conversation was how the priest being willing to do this was a reminder that yes, there are victims of this horrible abuse, but that this crisis in the church, this scourge of abuse, has harmed not only those individuals but the church itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think he was almost prescient in his ability to understand that this went beyond the person who had been directly harmed. It may begin there, but that this was a betrayal of all of the people in the church, of trust, it devastated communities. It didn't just destroy one person, it devastated communities. And he stood there owning that and acknowledging that on behalf of the church week after week. And he actually shared with me at one point in time that walking through the streets with his collar on, people would spit on him. And because he was visibly representing himself as a Catholic priest. And it just struck me the courage and fortitude that he had to do that, and the example that he was setting, that I wish many more had followed.
That brings us back to those difficult months and years, the events in Boston, the massive wave of the abuse crisis in 2002 and following. It was in 2002 that the bishops met in Dallas and put together what come to be known as the Dallas Charter and the essential norms that went along with it, sort of codifying the charter for the rest of us. And it's from that charter that we get this idea of a victims assistance coordinator. It's not that term isn't used, if I'm correct, in the charter, victims assistance coordinator, but every diocese is required to have someone, a representative. Heather, tell us about the origins of the victims assistance coordinator. Where did this position come from? It didn't, the charter mandated, but it didn't, there were actually dioceses who were doing this already. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Sure. There were dioceses that were doing this already in maybe an earlier iteration of this, but there were dioceses who had someone in a position where they were receiving reports of sexual misconduct by clergy and then coordinating a compassionate and resourced response to the victim survivor. And typically, by and large, that includes and is primarily individual therapy for the survivor. In the charter, as you said, it codified that. The idea was that this should not be something that only existed in dioceses that had evolved to that point of thinking about it, but that it was something mandatory, that every diocese would have someone in place who was prepared to do this work, who was skilled to do this kind of work. And so with the charter, we see the establishment of this expectation that there be a compassionate and timely resourced response to those who contact the church with reports of harm, or those who get referred to the church in other ways to make us aware of the harm that had been done to them and who had perpetrated that, so that that perpetrator could also be addressed. And handled in terms of being taken out of ministry and so forth. And it did that in combination with establishing the safe environment expectation, and that there be someone who is also attending to the prevention and education component. And those two are complementary, but they manifest differently in different dioceses. So the three of us are three versions of victims assistance coordinators. In other dioceses, they may look different, have different backgrounds, also have other responsibilities. It'll vary. And I think Courtney's going to talk more about that.
Yeah, Courtney, I wanted to ask you to your job in Washington looks a little bit different than it would for VAC elsewhere in the country. Tell us a little bit about how the position varies from diocese to diocese and how it works for you in Washington.
Well, again, I just want to thank you. And I'm so honored to be on this great panel with these wonderful people, because us all working together and learn from each other and their strengths and the different types of resources that each diocese provides, we get strength and guidance from in order so we can support our own diocese. So, the Archdiocese of Washington, when I came almost 7 years ago, did both, did victims assistance and was focused on the safe environment. So to Heather's point, it was kind of a merged position, and it still is today. But I do, after the struggles that the Archdiocese had in 2017 with Theodore McCarrick and a lot of adult misconduct came forward, our advisory board, in conjunction with the leadership of the Archdiocese, decided that it was time for the child protection broad to be expanded to address sexual misconduct and boundary violations. So we took on that as well. I think that is really critical, because what we try to advocate for and talk about it in front and foremost is to say everybody in the Archdiocese has a right to a safe environment and has a right to be educated and be empowered on how to report suspected abuse and misconduct. And so that's what our office in the last couple of years have evolved into. And, talking to other victims assistant coordinators throughout the country, I think that is empowering to all of us serving, but also the ones who are working in the trenches in the diocese throughout the United States to know that they have a new outreach and a new group to tap into.
Tom, you've been at this work for a while, for a long time. How have you seen it change? I'm thinking in particular of the events of, say, 2018, 2019, with an increased focus on vulnerable adults and different sort of categories of victim survivors. Tell us a little bit about how the work has changed in the last decade.
Well, in my opinion, first of all, in the 90s, I'm pretty sure the Archdiocese of Chicago was one of the first offices to have a victim assistance program. This was, I think Cardinal Cupich talked about this at that Harvard conference, that before any of this was codified in 2002, we were already doing this. And I think you pointed out, like, had we started in the 90s, as they talked about, this might be a different discussion today. But what I've noticed is, at first, when I started here, what I saw was a lot of what's been described, which was respond to victim survivors as soon as they come forward, provide them with assistance. But everything was coming from the diocese. What I've noticed, the biggest shift I've noticed, is the involvement of victim survivors. And the more that their voices are heard, the more that I believe the programs we can create are meeting their needs. So, like I've talked about the Mass for Hope and Healing. It's just a simple, on its face, there's a Mass. Any church can offer a Mass. But the Mass is so different when you have victim survivors saying, we want to be a part of it. We want to pick the readings. We want to have a deacon that was a victim survivor do the homily. The more they're involved with it, the more that's changed. And to me, that's been the biggest evolution since I started, is seeing more victim survivors taking a role in terms of saying, if you'll work with us, we'll let you know the kinds of things we need to heal.
That took time, though, didn't it? I mean, it wasn't, when they first started, you didn't have flocks of people showing up to get involved. There was a level of trust that you had to build.
Yeah, I mean, it started for me with one survivor. Mike Hoffman was available. And so when we did anything, Mike was always, yes, I'll do it. I'll help you. And so at the first Mass, it was Mike who spoke. But then gradually I would go on walks with other victims, and then Mike would speak at the beginning, Jim would speak in the end. And then another victim survivor, like Teresa, would write for our newsletter. And then suddenly another one said, I'll do this. And pretty soon you started getting groups of people that said, we'll do things. And then over time at the Mass, you might get one more victim survivor that says, I'm ready to be involved. But yeah, it did not happen easily. It took a lot of relationship building. It took a lot of time. But I think it's paid off.
I expect that Heather, you and Courtney both have similar experiences in working to build trust and relationships. Heather, talk about what it takes to build relationships. I mean, we're talking about a topic in which there's been a grave damage to a relationship of trust. How do you work to build relationships when trust is lacking at the outset?
When someone has been betrayed and we're trying to heal that relationship between the person who was betrayed and the person who betrayed them, I frame it in terms of demonstrating trustworthiness. You can't just say, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. That's not enough. The trust is broken with good reason. It's difficult to imagine trusting again. And so that has to be earned back. And that's earned not with one demonstration of trustworthiness, but with a consistency, a steadfast attention to demonstrating trustworthiness. So I would reiterate what Tom has said about It's about relationship building, and that takes time. I am incredibly mindful that every time my phone rings, the person on the other end could be taking this extraordinarily risky step of contacting the church where they were harmed, to ask for help from the church where they were harmed. And so I try as best I can, and I have a wonderful team of people that are similarly minded and similarly committed. We try to receive that call as the gift that it is. It's an opportunity for us to build a relationship. It's an opportunity for us to be church to that person in a way that they are desperately seeking and deserve and in need of, but approaching with great trepidation. So from the very moment of the first contact, it's critical that there's tremendous respect for the invitation that victim survivor is giving us to join them in relationship. And then it's about demonstrating that trustworthiness. So it's about saying what you will do and doing what you said you would do, and doing that in as timely a manner as you can, and being accountable for the things that you've offered to do or promised to check out or promised to figure out, or whatever it is that you follow through and follow up. And that's not always easy. There's a lot of detail management in this role that is unique and significant to that individual, and therefore important to us, but there's a lot of details to juggle and keep track of. But I think the other thing that I'm seeing in this context of what's changed and how do we build relationships is this idea that I'm also building relationships within the Archdiocese, within the people here at the Chancery. I work very closely with our legal team. I work very closely with our vicars for clergy. And I'm just back from speaking at the seminary to our 75 seminarians in formation, building relationships and awareness and sensitivity with all of those groups, and learning more myself about what they bring to the table, so I can communicate better with a victim survivor and coordinate services with more knowledge of all of those pieces. But that's resulting in things collectively. It's certainly not all my doing, but collectively, where now something is said. I'm thinking about this recent event where a priest was offering a homily not specific to child abuse or sexual abuse or clergy abuse in particular, but offering a homily. Something in what he said spoke to the heart of a victim survivor who went to him for confession. The day that she heard that homily was the first day she'd been in the church for years because of what had happened to her. She sought him out in confession. He was prepared in a sense, not specifically for her, but prepared in a sense so he could meet with her in that moment of reconciliation and then follow up with her appropriately afterwards, outside, later, as she sought him out for more support, connected her to us, and now she's receiving the services that we have to offer and support. It's all about relationship building and thinking with outside of the box in sort of what we've called this radical accompaniment, thinking in that broad way, but implementing it in specific and coordinated and contingent ways to genuinely nourish the drive to heal, genuinely support those efforts. And all of that's relationship building.
Courtney, I want to ask you about some of the newer kinds of cases that we've seen more focus on lately, specifically sort of abuse of power and sexual misconduct. But before I turn to you on that, I want to interject this question because it was sent in to us, and I think it's relevant here. One of the questions, all three of you are professionals in this. You've been trained for this. You have degrees in this kind of that makes you well suited to this kind of work. You have lots of experience doing this. One question is, how do folks who aren't don't have your backgrounds, how do say me or say Sarah, how do we interact with victims or survivors groups in a way that we're making sure that we're not re-wounding them, right? Someone comes to you, you know how to interact with people who have come to you with this kind of issue. That's not something that you just know how to do. So is there any advice that you have for how to interact with victim survivors, for those of us who aren't trained clinicians? How do we interact with them in a way that either directs them in a way that is helpful, but at the very least is not re-wounding them?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, one thought I have that I keep hearing from victim survivors is, I think we all have the capacity to listen. So if we start from that point of view of listening to the victim survivor, hearing what they have to say, making space for them to guide us as to what they need next, and even being transparent with them if we're afraid or we're not sure how to help, but that we want to help. I think that's a pretty good place to start.
Yeah,
Courtney, you were gonna.
I agree. I was just gonna say, I mean, in so many cases when I talk to survivors or victims who are living it currently, is that they just want to be heard. And so often they don't have the platform or the safe environment to share their story. And you know, when I was working as an investigator for child sex abuse and fatalities, you see these kids, little kids whose voice are not able to be heard. And when we talk to survivors who are sharing their history, again, you can see that they are sharing with something that they weren't able to share before. And I think that along what Heather had said and earlier about trust building and relationship building, it really also starts with them knowing that you're actually listening to what they're saying. And I think that once they realize, people and families and relatives of victims of abuse, they all come together. It does take a village. And for so long, the survivors and victims have been alone. And part of them coming forward is their draw to community. And just coming off of Easter and dealing, walking through, and again, I'm not super holy, so my diocese who are watching this will be like, oh God, but Jesus, a lot of people say like Jesus walked the cross alone. These victims and survivors have their own cross. So we as a community coming together are helping carry that cross. They are not alone anymore. And I think that is part of how we facilitate that. But I think it's also important what Heather and Thomas said before, that our educating individuals with safe environment resources and information allows for community members to help alleviate the burden of being alone as well. And also bring it out to the front. I mean, I think we all can say that growing up, or, not growing up, but being a part of this, one of the evolutions that we have seen, at least I have seen, I don't want to speak for anybody else, is that the subject of child sex abuse, regardless, whether it's religion or at home, or has been hidden in the dark. Part of what I've seen in the Archdiocese of Washington with support of our advisory board, as well as, it's really with the leaders too, is that this issue is being brought to the forefront, and we are blowing it up in lights because we're not ashamed to talk about it. We're here to eradicate it, and we're also here to support. So, but I don't know if I said, sorry, Heather, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm building on what you and Tom are both saying and thinking about, if somebody chooses to disclose first to a friend or a family member or an acquaintance at church, somebody that they just, for some reason, they feel safe disclosing there, it's startling information. You know what I mean? You don't expect to hear it necessarily. And then you feel this ominous sense of, oh my gosh, I've just been told something important that's hard to take in. And there can be a tendency to go, well, things like, are you sure? Or or, well, what exactly happened? Or, well, why didn't you tell somebody before? Your own discomfort with the disclosed information leads to, I think, Stephen, part of what you were talking about, this, what if I'm saying the wrong things? So, you don't have to understand it all to be present and to receive it. And I think Tom's statement about genuinely disclosing, like, I was not expecting that, or I had no idea, or it's a lot to take in. I'm getting my feet back under me on this. I don't know exactly what to say or do for you. What do you need? How can I help? That is so much better. And I would liken it very much to the same kind of discomfort people often feel about grief. It's like, if I talk about it, it's going to make them miss the person more, which, I think at some level we all know is completely erroneous, but we still fall into that, what should I say? What really matters is that you don't run away from it, that you don't shut it down or push it back or say something like, oh no, not Father so-and-so, he would never. Because that's very, very dismissive of someone who's just taken a huge risk, and probably manifest their worst fears about making a disclosure.
And the only thing I'd add is you don't have to fix it.
You can't fix it, right? Not only do you not have to, but you can't.
Yeah.
So yes, to sort out what's your stuff, and then what do you have to offer to this person who in their pain has reached out to you. Yeah. And as I said, we really try to see it as a gift. I mean, it's not a pretty kind of gift to get, but it's a gift because it's a statement of willingness, an invitation to relationship. And that's where the healing can happen.
And also to build on Heather, what you just said, it's a gift, but I say to my team, we talk about, it's a privilege. It's a privilege for someone to share their trauma. It means that they're ready to start the healing or look for help. And, I'm honored in our capacity as a victim's assistant person to help them facilitate that and put the proper and appropriate resources in place.
Yeah, and I'd even say that, I've often thought of it as that moment they call, it's the difference between either re-traumatizing them or offering them a step towards healing.
Right.
Yeah. Agreed.
I want to turn the conversation in a direction I promised earlier. Over time, and especially since 2018, there's been an increased focus on other kinds of abuse of power and sexual misconduct involving adults that is not the same problem that came under so much scrutiny and attention, say, after 2002, which was primarily predation upon children. How are your offices, and each of you in particular, adapting to these changing understandings of sexual misconduct in the church? It's in one sense, these other categories of abuse clearly are connected in some way to sexual abuse of children, but in other ways that might not be immediately obvious, it's very, very different, and how those cases get handled is different. Courtney, would you talk a little bit about how that has played out in the Archdiocese of Washington, and how your office handles this sort of growing awareness of another side to this problem?
Sure. As I said, I think in 2018 with the McCarrick, and then the grand jury, Pennsylvania grand jury report blew up. It was brought before the advisory board, and I think like our moderator, the Courier, and the Cardinal at the time, that we have a problem, and we don't have a safe environment for adults, for people who are struggling with this misconduct. And it was that unfortunate depiction of everything gets swept under the rug. It was applicable to adults. So our advisory board, which is led by a wonderful woman named Dr. Eileen Dombo from Catholic University, she chairs it, and she's a specialist in trauma. She understood that this is a problem, and the board came together and said, we need to provide a safe place for these adults, because it's the problem is that when you're a vulnerable adult, or when somebody goes to a clergy person for help, they're vulnerable. And, and sometimes we get into, there was a belief that they would become dependent. And unfortunately, everybody's human. And I mean, not unfortunately, we all are human. And so there needed to be an expectation of behavior that needed to be enforced. The boundaries were a problem and continue to be one, because, and clergy necessarily doesn't like to hear this, even though Cardinal Gregory does, is that we're providing a service. The church provides a service. It's very pastoral, but it also is something that there's an expectation of behavior that needs to be enforced. And so the advisory board, in conjunction with our child protection policy, expanded to child protection safe environment. And when someone, a person, whether it's male or female, has a abuse of power report or an adult misconduct report, they have a place to come now, which is a safe landing. And then our office will work in conjunction, whether it be HR or the vicar of clergy office or colonel, to address and investigate those allegations. If it's an assault, or if it's a definite crime, we work and report it immediately to the civil authorities. But it is that kind of ambiguous gray area where you get a little bit of a resistance, and you say, oh, well, it's a he said, she said, or he said, she said. No, this is where we all have to look. And the advisory board looks at it, and then we make recommendations to the cardinal, and we work in that capacity.
Tom, am I right in understanding that in the Archdiocese of Chicago, there's an entire separate office for vulnerable adults, and separate from allegations involving children? How is that handled in Chicago?
Generally, when the vicars for priests will handle adult allegations, adult meaning that's the go-to place. We work collaboratively together in terms of when the victim survivor comes forward, trying to assist them and help them go forward. There's also a preventative component of this. For the last several years, there's the Critical Conversations program that's been available to priests. Actually, I facilitated it for a number of years, as well as what they're doing in the seminaries. So again, while this is all an evolution, the upside of that program, in my opinion, was it allowed priests a chance to talk about these topics and make it real. So it isn't some abstract idea. It covers topics like, well, what do you do when there may be an experience where you might be tempted to cross a boundary? How do you deal with pornography, alcoholism, any number of topics? But yeah, so we try to respond to the adults when they come forward and give them the support they need.
Heather, tell us a little bit about how it works in Los Angeles.
Sure. LA has actually been taking adult matters to our review board for decades. So that's something that we've been doing really since early on, in the recognition that there were issues of sexual misconduct and the impact that they were having. And so our board has reviewed those adult matters for a long time. There are certainly, as Courtney and Tom have both talked about, the distinctions between mandated reports for minors, appropriate reporting of criminal level activity, and then all the gray area in between that seems to fall into the sexual harassment realm, and this is always difficult to navigate, but how if any, how much mutuality, if any, was there in this process? And that's a tough one for me. In fact, I was speaking with the seminarians about this just yesterday, about the attributions and expectations that come when you make a public vow of celibacy, and that it is their responsibility. It is their responsibility to protect the boundaries that go with a vow of celibacy. And I liken it very much to the training that I imagine both Courtney and Tom got as clinicians, in terms of who is responsible for protecting the person that we're interacting with, recognizing the differential of power from the get-go, and that it is my responsibility. And that if I'm struggling with fulfilling that responsibility, that there are clear strategies I'm to engage in order to protect the client, that it is not about me, it's about them and their protection. And then I deal with my needs or my challenges independently of that. So we have programs happening in the formation series at the seminary, and I'm fortunate to be a part of that on a regular basis. We also have a Becoming Home program, which is an ongoing support for extern priests who come to the diocese from other dioceses and typically from out of the country. So we're also addressing cultural matters in that program very specifically, because we have priests coming to us from other parts of the world. So even things about proximity and touching that is not overtly sexual, but may be perceived as sexual, or be at the very least confusing to someone here who has grown up in the very complex and certainly not homogeneous, but culture of the United States. So we have ongoing programs about that. And then our vicars for clergy work through the issues with the priest. And there are times when priests have been removed from ministry. There are times when criminal reports and charges have been brought. And then there are times when it's been sorted through, worked through with support and therapy for the priest, in addition to the support that my office is coordinating for the victim survivor. And I think the other thing that's happened here in LA, and I imagine this is not unique, is we've really become the place for resource and support for all matters of sexual misconduct, no matter who it is. Yeah. So it can be a volunteer parent coach, it can be a teacher or a catechist, or we're also providing support, I should say, and we're also providing support when a report of suspected child abuse is made by one of our mandated reporters. We're supporting the reporter, and we're supporting with resources and referrals the family or the individual that's impacted. So in a sense, victims assistance coordinators are responding to victims of sexual misconduct in all shapes and forms in LA. And as I said, I don't believe we're the only diocese that has evolved to that place. I see both Tom and Courtney shaking their heads in agreement with that.
I mean, I've seen that's part of it's part of the privilege and the beauty of this position and the ability that, people in leadership allow the office to evolve. Our office, like Heather, our office has been able, we work with helping people report abuse interfamily, like I said, outside of clergy. We're there to help them understand and walk through the process to make sure that that everything is being reported appropriately. I think that the training, as you said, Heather, of going to the seminary is critical. But before, at least, it was done in-house. I think the beauty of what's happening is they're bringing in the lay people who are the experts in helping educate the people who are in the trenches. And, and I think that's such a positive move in the right direction, because I always say, what I know. Like, it's so critical to be transparent. What I know. Like, if a complaint comes in, regardless if it's, misconduct or regardless if it's clergy or a coach or a teacher or, CYO person, you say, what I know. Like, there isn't any secrets. And that's what is so important to get to the community is that what you see is basically what you're going to learn. And I'm with you one step of the way.
One of the things that I've heard all three of you mention now is your work with seminaries. And this isn't exactly something we had planned on talking about, but this is a really interesting thing. I know there are a lot of Catholics who have questions about what is the church doing to help train new priests and to form them in a way that's going to help solve problems that we've had for decades. It sounds like all three of you were involved with at least speaking with seminarians and helping shape them and form them. What kind of formation, that you don't have to reenact the whole thing here, but what kind of formation is this? Just a once a semester sort of overview of reporting requirements? What kind of training is involved for each of you?
Well, I mean, there is that, there's the standard requirements that everyone has to go through, the safe environment training that everyone has to go through, priests and everyone else. But what I found through the programs like the Critical Conversations, or they're specifically training for new pastors where they cover these different topics. What I find is, one, just talking about these difficult topics is a step in the right direction. Two, out of those groups, it's often really normalizing, and it universalizes the struggles that they have when they're in a group. Because what I find is so many of these guys are either in isolation in a parish, or if they are struggling with an issue where maybe they're tempted to cross a boundary, you're a priest. Who do you talk to about that? Do you, like when Heather was talking about us and our training, well, it's pretty common to go in a consultation when you're a therapist. Well, when you're a priest, if you don't know others are also struggling with this, that becomes a dilemma. So one of the great things, I think, is bringing them together, giving them a space to talk openly and honestly in a safe environment about these struggles.
I agree. I love going in and just no PowerPoints, no, like, because it glaze over, like just getting in there. I just went a couple weeks ago, pulling up a chair and just saying like, okay, you've done the training. Now I'm here to answer any questions or go through any situation with you. And what I find is it's such a powerful component because they like literally roll up their sleeves and they're like, what about this? So like a 20-minute,
Right.
scheduled meeting turns into like an hour and a half.
Well, I've been just thinking as you were saying that, I can think of a number of times where I would sit with a group of priests and I would say to them, you have to realize you are men, and you are men that listen well. Many women are going to be attracted to you simply because you listen well. You may not clue into what that's communicating to them, but you have to be aware of what that's communicating to them.
Yeah.
That even if you think I'm just listening, I'm being friendly, there's a lot of room for misunderstandings and a lot of room for unintentional boundary crossings, apart from anyone you might be thinking about intentionally.
Right. Yes, that's very good, Tom. We get like that they're listening. And usually like you go to get support about a situation and what with a family member, whether it's
Right.
the husband, and then you get this, because as we are the same, but priests go into fix it. And sometimes say like, you can't fix it.
Right.
You can't fix it. Like,
Right.
so I think that's interesting. That's very true.
Yeah.
At St. John's Seminary, they have a couple of times a year what they call formation days, where they give a whole day to a given topic. And that's on top of the formation process that's going on all year long and is being implemented internally, as Courtney made mention of. So for the past 5 years, with one skip for COVID, I've gone out to the seminary. And the first time I went was with Suzanne Healy, my predecessor. And we showed the movie Spotlight with all of the seminarians there, and then tried as best we could to facilitate a discussion with 100 people, which is a bit of a challenge, but we did it. And it was profound watching them watch that movie and the questions and concerns that they raised, which really spoke to my heart in the sense that they were asking a lot of what I would call the right questions.
Right.
It wasn't, well, how do you protect the priest? It was, how could this have happened? What do I need to understand? Why didn't this happen? They were the right questions. If I could have made a list of the right questions for them to ask, that's what I was hearing by the vast majority of them. So since then I've done, we haven't watched the movie again, although it's a new crop of seminarians, so we maybe could do that again. But since then, I've done a variety of things. And yesterday was very powerful because I was accompanied by a victim survivor who is well advanced in his process of healing. And a big part of his healing is focused on bringing people back to the church, feeling safe to come back to the church, and wanting to work with clergy to do that. And so he spoke to them for an hour and a half yesterday morning on his experience, and he was harmed by one of our worst known and multiple victim pedophiles. And he spoke to them about that, and they were riveted, absolutely riveted. And listening to the ways in which this priest got access to Joe, they were then able, when I spoke in the afternoon and I got into what I call the nitty gritty, this is why you aren't alone in a room. This is why you speak up when someone says, oh, why can't I just have a key to this? And why does so-and-so have to know everything? These are the things you do with vigilance and with steadfast commitment so that the holes where someone can sneak through can't even happen. Mm-hmm. We talked about being kind, listening men of faith here to, preach the gospel that God is love. That is, as Tom said, that in and of itself, to someone who is so deeply wounded and so desperately seeking human connection with someone who's safe, that can be the opening to boundary violations that you never intended, but you get drawn into. And so we talked about everything from mandated reporting, and here's the link to our archdiocesan handbook with all the resources you could ever possibly want. We talked about boundaries and being consistent in enforcing them. We talked about when you're in trouble, when you're struggling, who do you go to?
Right.
And I think it's important to acknowledge too that there's a lot of, I'll say for sure, anxiety, and in some cases fear, that any priest or priest in formation is one phone call away from having his life destroyed by an allegation. Mm-hmm. And I'm very mindful that when we're in a place of fear, we're not operating at our best. We're at an instinctual level, we're at a reactive level. And so I talked with them about it's important to be able to bring all your faculties to responding to these kinds of situations, to both prevent and respond appropriately and not from a place of fear. So if something is happening or you're struggling or something happens to you, you need to talk to people. And who do you talk to? You go to the vicars. You can call my office. You've got priest support groups. You've got a deanery chair. You've got your bishop. Talk to somebody. We've got to break the silence. And that goes for victim survivors. And that goes for priests too, because if they're not dealing with their humanity and their struggles, we're only pushing it below the surface for a period of time before something blows up.
And also, Heather, I think you hit something really important too, is that the clergy are not the enemy, right? Like we hear all these, like they're not the enemy. And so I went and spoke to the chaplains, military chaplains a while ago, and you could feel that some of them were really angry that they had to listen to me, which, I did not take personally, but they said, well, you don't understand. We have targets on our back. And I said, you know what? You absolutely do. Like right now you do, but you have to implement, and I encourage you to use the resources available to you to protect yourself and then serve to your community and be a powerful minister in your area so you can serve the community without getting kind of down the rabbit hole. I think it's really important.
I can't help but wonder, with some hopefulness, I have to admit, what all of this training and this approach that is so deeply implemented now in our dioceses and for our seminarians, what dividends that might pay 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, when a lot of these guys, these young seminarians are bishops. They're running, dioceses with millions of people in them, and how much of a difference it would have made if we were doing this 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, and I think it's important to add here, I really do, since I only do the victim side and not the safe environment side specifically, I don't want to forget, we as a church, the church in the United States is training hundreds of thousands of people from kindergarten through any adult who's involved in ministry with youth. We are changing not just the church, but we're changing our communities by empowering. So kids know what is happening to them and they can label it. Joe didn't know what was happening to him when this started. He shared that yesterday. He said, I love this priest, and his attention to me made me feel so special. he didn't understand initially. He knew he didn't like it, but he didn't understand it for what it was. We're training kids so that they not only can articulate what it is, but then they know what to do with that information and those feelings. They know to talk to somebody and they expect to be believed. That's changing the world. And I agree with you. I wish it had all been happening forever so that none of us needed to be in the jobs that we're in, but we are making a huge difference. And I think the church is changed because of it. And we'll see, as you said, the dividends in the years to come. I also find the seminarians, they're just hungry for this. They absolutely want to know how they can fulfill their vocations in a way that is healthy for the people that they want to serve. And they want to know it in a sort of abstract theological way, but they also want to know the nitty-gritty of it. What are the details of it? What do I do and don't I do so that I don't confuse people or inadvertently hurt people? The church is changing, and it's changing for the better. It really is. I'm confident of that.
And Heather, to your point also, and sorry, Tom, I know.
No, go ahead.
But to your point about we're educating and we are empowering kids, that we're also giving kids a voice through training the faculty and coaches, that they go home and they tell their parents, and parents like, don't tell anybody. Like, they have other avenues if that should happen. And I think that's a game changer too. And there are other avenues where kids and adults can report, not just inside their family system, which sometimes holds the shame or the guilt. And we're trying to remove the shame and guilt because there isn't any.
Well, I guess what I was going to say, building on what you were talking about, Heather, is that, or this idea of like, hopefully this training will pay off down the road with the priest. I mean, for me, that payoff will be that they feel freed up from thinking about themselves so much in terms of worrying about, oh, will I be spit on? Will I be called name? That they'll have a space within them that will say, look, I'm part of this narrative, that the adults coming forward were children that were hurt by my brother priest. And my role is to be present for them as much as I can be. And if that means I have to hear things, well, I want to try to make a space for them. And like, I'm fortunate that I work with a couple of priests in particular who have been available to victim survivors, who do the Mass every year, who I can call and say, could you please be available to talk to some victim survivors? And it's only through that collaborative relationship between those priests and through the victims that some of these programs have kind of taken off, that have offered some healing, And so I hope that, this training leads them to say, this isn't about me. It's about being available to those who've been harmed,
Also, the one thing that's
really important, because for people who have come back to the church to heal from this abuse, we're wonderful people. Courtney and Tom and I, we're good people. We're doing, not that you and Sarah aren't, Stephen, but we're doing good work. We're good people. That's all well and good. But what can be the missing piece is the presence of clergy in the healing process. And so what Tom is saying is so important. Those priests who, and I talked a little bit about this with the seminarians yesterday. I was working with a priest who I thought had done an amazing job in terms of transitioning a victim survivor to me and then staying on the journey with us. And I was talking with him afterwards about it, and he's like, I was holding on for dear life. I didn't know what to say. I was so nervous. He felt so ill-equipped, and he felt so concerned that he had failed in multiple steps along the way. And it was a real eye-opener for me, because I realized I hadn't been as affirming of him and his efforts as I could have been had I been tuned into that. So I think it's really critical. That's why those apology meetings with Archbishop or the bishop of the diocese are so important, because and it surprises me at some level, but at another it makes perfect sense. To hear the leader of your church apologize to you for what was done is huge. So we have to have those clergy as partners in this process, and helping them understand and feel comfortable enough that they can do that ministry is important. And I have my list of go-tos as well. And that's critical, because I know I can send a victim survivor to them and they'll be received by someone who can handle that. And hopefully
what you just said about that meeting with the bishop or the cardinal of the diocese.
Yeah.
I would say most of the people that are very involved in our diocese, meaning most of the victim survivors, were people that had gone and met with the cardinal. And after that, it's secured a space for them to say, let's continue to build on this relationship going forward. And now they're involved in all kinds of things. But I think that's a pretty moment for certain victim survivors that want it.
And one thing that the Archdiocese did, unfortunately, it was a little detour during COVID, is that they started with our social justice or social concerns department was the Way Retreat, which is for victims of abuse come and go on a retreat, and they go with clergy and with clinicians, and they're able to go through a very intense time to come into get in touch with themselves, find out what they need, and really connect with a clergy or themselves, God, whatever, but they are in a safe and place where they can really get connected with the church and come back and then build on that as well.
And that really speaks too, Courtney, to the range of things that we offer. I mean, I know I said earlier, primarily what we offer is therapy, and that's true in LA. That's the primary thing that we offer. And quite honestly, that's probably the most important specific resource we can make available to a victim survivor, to have trauma-informed care by someone who has that expertise. But it doesn't end there. And there are other things that go with that, and certainly offering retreat opportunities and offering psychoeducational opportunities, and those are the kinds of things that unfold in your relationship over time, and you start to learn either the victim survivor is able to tell you something more, or you can discern something because of the contact that you're having. And so there are opportunities that present itself to add to that range of healing resources and services that are provided.
Well, and I'd say along those lines that increasingly I see my role as being one of facilitating and supporting victim survivors, so that beyond just providing them with help is supporting them to pursue the interest they have, whether it's Jim leading peace circles in Minneapolis, or the Awake Milwaukee, or helping the folks at the Healing Voices, supporting them to take the lead of their own healing with other victim survivors and letting that grow. And then suddenly you get a new generation of people able to help others. That's satisfying to me.
Yes.
We are almost out of time. I want to close on this question, and I'll pose it to each of you in turn. What is the one thing that you wish people knew about the work that you do? Your average Catholic in the pew, maybe a victim survivor who's feeling trepidation or fear about coming forward. What's the one thing about the work that you do that you wish people knew about? Courtney, we'll start with you.
Well, as I said to Cardinal Gregory, my team, myself, we all know we are never going to be invited to an office Christmas party or any sort of Christmas party. Part of what I think is important is that our office is really independent to work with victims and allegations that aren't that follow the lay of the law. I think also, which I think promoting these programs, educating individuals, helping report non-clergy offenses, here to really address all allegations of abuse and neglect and misconduct, and that we're here 24/7 to make sure that every voice is heard. I mean, no one wants to hear the good stuff. They want to hear the bad stuff, but I think that's the good stuff.
Heather?
All of what Courtney said, and I imagine all of what Tom is going to say. I think sometimes, some days when I'm feeling a little weary, I think my wish would be that people even knew we existed, because I think sometimes, and I don't mean just me or my office, I think sometimes people really do not know that the church is doing all that it is doing to support and foster healing for those who've been harmed. And so I think that would be On my lower days, that's it. But usually by the end of the day, I can go home with a feeling of confidence and gratitude that I'm a part of genuine healing. People are healing. They are growing and becoming more confident and feel heard, and their lives are blossoming. And it's possible. And it's possible to do in partnership with the church. That won't work for everyone. I recognize that, but it is possible. And so I would want people to know that healing is possible.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, again, everything that's been said. And like I said before, I think to me, knowing that the Office of Assistance Ministry is there to help facilitate healing from the moment someone comes forward, and hopefully as the years go by, and that we know that people may leave and they may come back, and they may settle and they may come back, and that the goal is to try to be there over time, because we know that healing takes time.
Thank you to all of you so much, first and foremost, for the work you do on behalf of survivors and on behalf of our church. Thank you also for spending this hour with us. We hope people found it helpful. Those of you who are tuning in, feel free to share the video around. You can find out more about the work of the Catholic Project at thecatholicproject.org or catholicproject.catholic.edu. Thank you so much to all of you.